Christology. Christology is a theological discipline that studies Jesus Christ. And during this three-part Christological series, we are focusing on all that Jesus endured during the last week of his life. That week started at Palm Sunday, and that week is called the Passion Week. And then the actual Passion itself is a theological word that describes all that Jesus suffered during the final 12 hours of his life. The word passion is from the Latin language and means having suffered. And the 2004 Mel Gibson blockbuster movie called The Passion of the Christ chronicled those last 12 hours. The big idea of this three-part series has been to examine the Passion from a legal and judicial perspective, because no one has ever suffered the gross injustices Jesus suffered during his final hours. Since 1992, there has existed a nonprofit organization called the Innocence Project. The Innocence Project is committed to exonerating wrongful convictions through the use of DNA. To date, that organization has freed 301 convicts, people accused wrongly and have been exonerated and freed, 18 of them on death row. But none of those extraordinary cases can compare to the injustices committed against Jesus during the time of his passion. It is important to understand that after his arrest in the garden, Jesus was then subjected to two basic trials. Two trials. One was Jewish and religious, and the second one was Roman, secular, and more political. But each of those trials consisted of three separate phases, three religious phases and three secular phases, meaning that altogether Jesus faced 6 successive different legal proceedings throughout the night. Now, this past Sunday morning, we discussed the first phase to the Jewish religious legal proceedings, and that phase was an irregular and unauthorized inquisition at the residence of a former high priest named Annas. At some point, this happened between 1:30 and 3 a.m. on Friday morning. But Annas wasn't actually able to formulate a specific charge against Jesus, and so let's begin at the second phase. The second phase of the religious trial was bringing Jesus to the house of the current Jewish high priest, Caiaphas. This is another unauthorized meeting. Happened about 3 a.m. Most, if not all, of the Jewish Sanhedrin also rushed to be present at this meeting. Remember, the Jewish Sanhedrin, the Jerusalem Great Sanhedrin, consisted of 71 different members and constituted Israel's highest legal court. It was the same as our Supreme Court. And the high priest acted as head of that legal body. And most of the members were probably present at this impromptu meeting. But that didn't constitute a legitimate meeting, because those men shouldn't have even convened. This meeting shouldn't have happened, because the Mosaic Code specifically stated that the Sanhedrin could not meet at night. And this is the middle of the night. And so in a technical sense, all the proceedings that occurred at Caiaphas' house were illegal. This is all illegal. Now, notice specifically what happened at that meeting. Chapter 26, verse 59. Now the chief priests, the elders, and all the council, again this council was a Sanhedrin, sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death. Verse 60, but found none. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. But at last, 2 false witnesses came forward. Now, because Jesus was innocent, completely innocent of any wrongdoing, the only possible means of convicting him would have been on the basis of false testimonies. That meant in order to bring a credible charge against him, the accusers would have to make something up. But the problem was that although different people agreed to perjure themselves and lie under oath to Caiaphas, no one was able to actually manufacture something that seemed believable to this religious court. But then two false witnesses stepped up and created a bogus charge that on the surface seemed it might be something this religious court might be able to use against Jesus. Verse 61. These two false witnesses said, "This fellow, Jesus, said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." Verse 62, and the high priest arose and said to him, "Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" Now, the exact statement Jesus had made earlier that these fraudulent witnesses are now attempting to use against him, that statement is, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." But those men had twisted and distorted that statement to mean that Jesus intended to tear down the Jerusalem temple. To dismantle the temple would constitute the ultimate sacrilegious act against Judaism. And this court understood that. And so that was the charge these men had concocted against Jesus. But Jesus had no intention of destroying the actual Jerusalem temple, because he meant, through that statement, he meant the temple of his body. He meant if his body were destroyed, if his body were to die, he would restore it. He was essentially predicting his own death and resurrection from the dead. But there was no audio or video recording or hard copy transcript of that statement. And because there were no other witnesses present at this impromptu hearing, witnesses that had actually heard Jesus' statement and could contradict that charge, because none of them were even there, those false witnesses could completely falsify what Jesus said and get away with it. Please notice that these testimonies would have been inadmissible in a legitimate religious hearing, because we mentioned last time these men were not able to recall the exact date, exact time, and exact location of that statement Jesus had made. And according to the Mosaic judicial law, those details were required before the charge could be accepted before the court. The Sanhedrin guaranteed someone being prosecuted 3 things. First, it guaranteed an open and public trial. These were secret proceedings. Unacceptable. Second, the prisoner was guaranteed the right to self-defense. There had to be someone there to represent him and defend him against the charges brought against him. Jesus had no one. And third, there had to be 2 or 3 witnesses to the crime itself. And although this court ultimately did find 2 witnesses, these men concocted a lie. Verse 63. But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest answered and said to him, "I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Caiaphas, the high priest, demanded Jesus affirm or deny 2 basic things. 1, affirm or deny that he was the Christ. Remember, Christ means Messiah. Messiah is the ultimate human anointed ruler from God, sent to earth. And second, Jesus was to affirm or deny that he was the Son of God. And that phrase, Son of God, meant equal to God. It meant the same as God. So the 2-part question from Caiaphas was this: was Jesus the promised Messiah? Was he that ruler God had promised to the Jewish people? And second, was Jesus the Son of God? Was he God in actual human form? Caiaphas wanted Jesus to incriminate himself here in responding to these questions, which was another illegality. He couldn't do this, but he did. Verse 64, Jesus said to him, "It is as you said." Mark's gospel records Jesus answered, "I am." Meaning Jesus confessed to Caiaphas in front of this court that he was the promised Messiah. "I am the Messiah." He confessed that he was God's Son, meaning God incarnate. "I am God's Son." I remember seeing a PhD from Boston College on the program Dateline. He was a historical revisionist, and he was attempting to revise the traditional historical crucifixion account. He happened to be an agnostic. And this professor proposed that Jesus hung on the cross and made the statement, "See, you were wrong. I am not the Messiah." That's what this professor said. He said, that's impossible. Because just hours earlier, at this impromptu illegal gathering at the house of Caiaphas, Jesus specifically told Caiaphas that he was the Christ, he was the promised Messiah. Amazing. Verse 65. Then the high priest tore his clothes, saying, "He has spoke blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard his blasphemy." To blaspheme God means to defame God in some sense, meaning God is defamed. To defame means to infringe on or to be injurious to someone's reputation and or character. To blaspheme God means to defame God in his person and in his actions. Caiaphas insisted, after hearing this admission from Jesus, that he had in fact blasphemed God because he had defamed God in his person through claiming to be both Messiah and God himself. And Caiaphas was so upset about that, he literally ripped his robes apart, just tore them apart. The book of Leviticus said that the high priest could not tear his garments, could not tear his robes. But the Jewish Talmud said judges that witnessed blasphemous statements had a right to react out of grief and righteous indignation at the blasphemy and tear their robes if they agreed to sew them up at a later time. Apparently Caiaphas intended to do that. He just ripped his robes apart. I contend Caiaphas put on this theatrical, overdramatic exhibition of tearing his clothes, not just to give the impression he was completely disturbed at what he perceived to be a blasphemous claim from Jesus, but he was also excited that he felt he now had a legitimate reason to charge Jesus with a capital offense. So he asked the other representatives from the Sanhedrin a rhetorical question, verse 66. "What do you think? Gentlemen, you have heard his admission. He admits to being Messiah and the Son of God." They answered and said, "He is deserving of death." The Mosaic Code required someone found guilty of uttering blasphemous statements was to be executed. And that is exactly what the religious authorities wanted to do to Jesus. Verse 67, "Then they spat in his face and beat him, and others struck him with the palms of their hands." That would be a slapping motion, slapping him. Jesus was beaten repeatedly, and Luke's account indicates he was also blindfolded and beaten. Others spit in his face. And that was considered the ultimate insult, to spit in someone's face. But that was only the beginning. The high priest Caiaphas and those Sanhedrin members present agreed that Jesus had essentially committed a capital crime. According to them, that crime was blasphemy. And together these men had determined that Jesus deserved the death sentence. And so the only technicalities left would be on how to legitimize those Sanhedrin proceedings and implement that death sentence as punishment. Remember, Rome occupied and ruled Palestine at this time. So only the Roman government could execute the death penalty. That meant, although the Sanhedrin could determine the guilt or innocence of someone accused of a capital offense, it couldn't execute that person if that person was found guilty. Only Rome had that authority to do that. That meant the Sanhedrin would have to present to the Roman government a compelling case in order to convince the Roman authorities to put Jesus to death. But the credibility of this case against Jesus had been compromised because the religious legal proceedings before Caiaphas had been conducted so quick and under the cover of darkness, and according to Jewish law, that was all illegal. The Roman government understood Jewish law and would know about those illegalities and could refuse to accept the case, to even hear the case. That's the reason sometime before 4 a.m., the council decided to adjourn for a brief recess and then reconvene to file a more formal verdict after sunrise, sometime between 5 and 6 a.m. The council did that so that they wanted to reconvene to do this again in daylight, so that if their decision against Jesus were brought into question, then the council members could assure the Roman authorities that their final verdict had been determined in full daylight as the Mosaic law required. And that meeting is described at the beginning of chapter 27. Now, remember, Caiaphas had questioned Jesus about his identity, and Jesus admitted to two things. He admitted to being the Messiah, the promised ruler to the Jewish people, and second, he also admitted to being the Son of God. The Son of God, that phrase means of the order of God. Jesus was not less than God or inferior to God, but Jesus as God's Son is the same as God himself. He is a member of the triune Godhead. And the religious authorities understood that admission because the high priest heard that statement from Jesus, and it so enraged him, he ripped his robes apart. That would have been the expected reaction from a high priest if he thought he heard someone blaspheme God in his presence. Jesus' claim to deity was then misconstrued by this kangaroo court as being blasphemous. If anyone else would have admitted to deity, it would have been blasphemous. But Jesus admitted to being God because he was God. Jesus was then beaten again, and the council adjourned and waited until just after sunrise to reconvene. I want to interject a footnote from an intellectual perspective. I do not understand how cults and non-Christian religions can actually argue that Jesus did not claim to be God. I don't understand that. That is so nonsensical to me. I can understand someone not accepting Jesus' claim to be God, but to argue Jesus did not claim to be God is moronic. His admission to Caiaphas that he was God's son was interpreted by him and by this council as a claim to being the same as God himself. And that's the reason the religious authorities wanted him dead. People, it's just a matter of historical record. Jesus claimed to be God. That was considered blasphemous to them. Matthew chapter 27, verse 1. When morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. The third and last phase of the Jewish trial occurred just after sunrise in front of the entire Sanhedrin council. This was a formal meeting, not an impromptu one. So remember the order. The Jewish religious trial. First, Annas, then Caiaphas, and most, if not all, the Sanhedrin. And then in a more formal sense, Jesus met the entire Sanhedrin and stood before them to be tried. The Sanhedrin again had to reconvene in the morning in order to render the decision that was made at the second phase seem legal under rabbinical code. Remember, at the earlier impromptu council, Caiaphas called the council meeting he had made the determination that Jesus had committed blasphemous statements and deserved to die. But because the meeting was conducted at night, the council realized it had to reconvene in the morning in order to legitimize that decision. It was also essential in capital cases that those proceedings had to be conducted in the Jerusalem Temple Council chambers and not just at the house of Caiaphas. And that seems logical. So the council met again after sunrise, probably just after 5 a.m. And this third phase amounted to just reasserting the same charges of blasphemy against Jesus. and then reaffirming the same decision to put him to death. So nothing different was decided. Nothing else was concluded. But the third phase was just another sham to pretend to comply to the religious judicial code, because technically it still didn't meet all the legal requirements that we discussed last time. Verse 2, and when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. Now please don't miss this. The principal accusation brought against Jesus at the three phases of his religious trial were blasphemy. The charges were that he had blasphemed God. But a blasphemous charge meant nothing to the Roman court. See, the Romans were polytheistic in a theological sense. The Roman people believed in multiple gods and goddesses, pagan gods and goddesses. And so the blasphemous charge against the Jewish deity meant nothing to the pagan Romans. That meant when Jesus was brought to the Roman government, the charge against him had to be changed. These men weren't going to be sympathetic to the fact that they felt Jesus had blasphemed their God, because they didn't even accept their God. So it wasn't a big deal to them. So the charge had to be changed from blasphemy to something else that the pagan Roman government would actually be concerned about. That charge, that change to the original charge brought against Jesus was in and of itself an illegal act. Suppose someone is arrested and brought to trial, and in the courtroom faces an identity theft charge. That's serious. Then suddenly, halfway through the courtroom proceedings, the charge is changed to an attempted murder charge. That's more serious. That wouldn't happen. That wouldn't be acceptable in modern jurisprudence. But that essentially what happened here. The original charge against Jesus was changed, so that now in the Roman court, Jesus was being accused of treason. And his accusers called him an insurrectionist. Their strategy was that if it could be proven that Jesus was guilty of attempting to overthrow the Roman government, the government of Caesar, then he could be put to death. Because that would be something that Pilate would be concerned about, and Caesar would definitely be concerned about. And so if they could just prove that he was a threat to the government as an insurrectionist, then he could be put to death. And that achieved the same desired end that the Sanhedrin wanted. So the religious authorities, or the temple elite, as some people call them, did not bring Jesus to Pilate to ensure he got a fair hearing. No. That was not the objective. Those men only wanted the governor to administer the death sentence, because legally they couldn't. So they had to appeal to him. But they didn't care really what the charge was, as long as Jesus would be dead. Only the Roman government had the right to exercise the death penalty. That's the reason the Sanhedrin appealed to the Roman governor Pilate. The Sanhedrin hoped Pilate would find Jesus guilty and sentence him to die. If that happened, then Rome could be blamed for the death of Jesus, and that would take the heat off the Jewish authorities. This is the first phase to the secular Roman examination. Jesus was brought before Pilate. I know. I know people, and I know some people, I've been told this. Some people don't appreciate history. And if you're one of those, you need to make an exception, because this history is spelled his story. And his story matters. Apart from his story, we have no purpose in existing. So hang in there, you non-history buffs. Hang in there. Just so you know, this is good stuff. Good stuff. Pontius Pilate was the Roman governor, or the procurator of the Judean region, and he governed from 26 to 36 AD, probably in his mid-40s at this time. Pilate was not Caesar. He was not head of the Roman Empire, because Caesar at that time was a gentleman named Tiberius Caesar, but Pilate was one of Caesar's regional representatives, and he had full command of the Roman troops assigned to his area. Please notice that the legal proceedings Pilate officiated took place outside his Jerusalem residence, called the Praetorium. That governor's mansion, called the Praetorium, also not only housed his residence, it also housed the judgment hall used to conduct the legal cases that were brought to him. Pilate's permanent residence was in Caesarea on the Mediterranean Sea coast. That's where he spent most of his time. But the reason Pilate was here in Jerusalem was because it was the Passover season, and he felt his presence was needed there in case there was a disturbance. And that's the basic reason he happened to be at Jerusalem. Jesus presented a serious dilemma to Pilate. On one side of the equation, Pilate felt compelled to do what the Sanhedrin wanted, because he couldn't risk them causing political unrest. He didn't want to upset the Sanhedrin. If Pilate upset the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin caused a disturbance, then Caesar would be upset at Pilate. Pilate would be risking his political career if he defied the Jewish establishment. And that upsetting might incite a riot during the biggest religious season on the Jerusalem calendar, so he didn't want to do that. But on the other side was the fact Pilate didn't want to condemn an innocent man to death, because if he did that, then he might incur violent resistance from the multitudes of common people that did accept Jesus as the Messiah. So Pilate was between the proverbial rock and a hard place. So he did what politicians still do, and tried to avoid issuing a decision on this case. We call that kicking the can down the road. Still do it. Let's move to verse 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" That's the same question as, "Are you the Messiah, the anointed ruler from God?" Jesus said to him, "It is as you say." Verse 12, and while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Interesting. Jesus is standing before Pilate, and these religious authorities are all around him, and started interrupting these legal proceedings and started restating accusations against Jesus. These Sanhedrin members are rude. Verse 13, then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" Verse 14, but he answered him not one word, so that the governor marveled greatly. It is at this point between verses 14 and 15 that Jesus is brought to see Herod. And that account is described in some detail in Luke chapter 23. This is the second phase to the secular Roman trial, and that was to bring Jesus to Herod. Now, Pilate had an idea he felt might extricate him from the problem the Sanhedrin had caused him. Jesus was from a Roman province called Galilee, and in a technical sense, Galilee was outside of Pilate's jurisdiction. In a technical sense, Galilee belonged to a region that was under the rule of one named Herod Antipas. Jesus was a political hot potato to Pilate. So Pilate decided to pass this Jesus hot potato problem onto Herod. Let him have it. It doesn't seem that Herod was that serious about prosecuting Jesus. He was just curious and thought Jesus might be a potential source of amusement. Herod started bombarding Jesus with repeated questions, and Jesus stood there and said nothing. He said nothing because he wasn't required to, because Herod had no jurisdiction in Jerusalem. Jesus was under no legal obligation to respond to Herod, and so he didn't. But Herod got tired of questioning Jesus, and he returned him to Pilate. This is the third and final phase to the Roman examination. Again, first time, Pilate passed him on to Herod, second phase, and now the third phase, Jesus is returned to Pilate. Verse 15. Now at the feast, the governor, Pilate, was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one prisoner whom they wished. Verse 16, at that time they had a notorious prisoner named Barabbas. Verse 17, therefore when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ? Now, Pilate is a thinking politician. He had one more ace in the hole. He decided to be a quasi-statesman and extend a strategic proposal to the people that he felt might get him out of this dilemma. There was a tradition that each Passover season in Jerusalem, the governor of Jerusalem, as a diplomatic gesture, was required to release one Jewish prisoner from Roman custody to the Jewish people. Pilate decided to use this particular custom to his advantage as a last-ditch effort to get himself out of this jam. This tradition did not mean that the governor automatically just released whichever prisoner the people might want to be released, but the practice was that the government authorities presented some pre-selected prisoners to the people, and then the people selected one person to be released from that group that had been pre-selected. And that convict release was given an automatic pardon. But this time, Pilate gave the people only two prisoners to choose from. One was Jesus, and the second one was a notorious inmate named Barabbas. Barabbas. The reason Pilate selected Barabbas is because he felt confident that such a despicable human being as Barabbas, the people would be afraid to have him released back out onto the streets. Barabbas had been convicted on counts of murder, insurrection, and robbery. He was an extraordinarily disgusting individual. Some historians theorize that Jesus was crucified on the actual cross that was originally constructed for Barabbas. Releasing Barabbas to the people would be similar to paroling Charles Manson. Charles Manson has been denied parole 12 consecutive times. The last time, prison authorities cited his uncontrolling behavior and mental health issues, including schizophrenia and paranoid delusional disorder, and said he presented too great a danger to society to be released. Really. At his next parole hearing, he will be 92. And it's extremely doubtful he's going to be paroled then. He's going to die in prison, and he should. So Pilate felt confident people wouldn't want Barabbas back on the streets. The staging of this legal debacle attracted a large number of interested common people in addition to the religious authorities, so Pilate felt confident the crowd would agree to releasing Jesus. So then he wouldn't have the Jesus problem anymore. So he felt confident that people would say, oh, sure, well, okay, we don't want Barabbas for sure because he'll be a threat to us, so yeah, keep him and give us Jesus. And if he did that, if he did release Jesus to the people, then it would seem he had complied with the desires and wishes of the people. If the multitude demanded he release Jesus to them, then the Sanhedrin couldn't blame Pilate for not doing what they wanted him to do, because he only did what the people wanted. On the surface, it seemed to be a brilliant diplomatic maneuver, but the problem was, it didn't work. Verse 18. For he, Pilate, knew that they, the Sanhedrin, had handed him over because of envy. The root problem was that these religious authorities that had Jesus arrested and tried were envious toward Jesus, because he had undermined their religious status with the common people. Jesus was popular and these men were not. Jesus healed and these men could not. Jesus taught with authority and these men did not. So the true motivation of this Sanhedrin was apparent to even a pagan politician like Pilate. These men were envious of Jesus. And that motivated them in part to do what they did. Verse 19, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him. On a normal basis, it would have been inappropriate that Mrs. Pilate interrupted this courtroom and interrupted these judicial proceedings. That wouldn't have happened. But the fact she did indicated how she felt about this case. This was a serious case. She understood Pilate's original feelings about this case, and she was afraid the Jewish authorities might coerce him into changing his mind. She wanted him to let Jesus go. And she was afraid that the pressure from these religious authorities would, in fact, change his mind. And, in fact, it did. Ultimately Pilate decided that it was politically expedient that he execute Jesus. Politically expedient. Pilate's political ambitions took precedence over whatever moral convictions he might have had. And so he was the one that ultimately signed the death warrant to murder Jesus. He was the one. Verse 20. But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitudes. Let me read that again. But the chief priests and elders, meaning the religious authorities, persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. Now, historical revisionists argue that it was only the small number of temple elite, chief priests, elders of the people, Sanhedrin, high priest. It was only the small number of temple elite that demanded that Jesus die. But this verse states that those religious authorities convinced multitudes of grassroots, normal, common Jewish people to demand the same thing. Some people have used this text to teach that because some of the ancient Jewish people were instrumental in the crucifixion of Jesus, then the entire Jewish race is responsible for his death. That is a false doctrine. That teaching is anti-Semitic. That has encouraged people to use the racial epithet Christ killers in reference to Jewish people, and has sometimes been employed to add justification to hate crimes and even the Holocaust. But that is so wrong. Understand this. Historically, there was no one group of people that was solely responsible for the death of Jesus. In fact, it was a coordinated conspiracy that included these Jewish high priests, the chief priests, the elders of the people, the Sanhedrin as a whole, the Roman government, Herod, Pilate, and multitudes of people from ancient Israel. It is significant that the crucifixion of Jesus is the only historical event where all these diverse factions combine together to achieve a common goal. Each of them bear the guilt. The Jewish people as a race were no more or no less to be blamed than the Gentiles. Let me repeat that. The Jewish people as a group, a people group, a race, were no more or no less to be blamed for the death of Jesus than were the non-Jewish Gentiles. But, that being said, in a theological sense, all of us are to blame, because our sins made the cross a mandate. Mel Gibson, in The Passion of the Christ, made some cameo appearances. Not completely. He injected some body parts. His left hand is seen holding the nail to be driven through the hand of Jesus. How many of you have seen The Passion of the Christ? If you haven't, I believe you should. It is not for children, but I believe every Christian should see that movie as a reminder of what Jesus did. That scene where Mel Gibson is holding the nail to be driven through the hand of Jesus had a symbolic meaning to Gibson, because he felt in doing that he was communicating that all humanity was responsible for the death of Jesus. He said, quote, I'm first on line for culpability. I did it. And so did all of us. We are all guilty of his death. Verse 21, the governor answered and said to them, which of the two do you want me to release to you? They said, Barabbas. Pilate said to them, what then shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? They all said to him, let him be crucified. Verse 23, then the governor said, why? What evil has he done? But they cried out all the more, saying, let him be crucified. So this mob is chanting, crucify him, crucify him. Verse 24, when Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a turmoil was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it. Pilate understood that he wasn't going to be able to convince these people of the innocence of Jesus. And so he gave in. He used this ceremonial hand washing to demonstrate his contempt at the fact he felt pressured to be a part of this conspiracy against Jesus. He wanted them to know that he was doing this under extreme personal protest. He didn't want to execute this man. He felt he was innocent. The problem is no ritual hand washing could release Pilate from his guilt in the crucifixion. Pilate had the legal authority to stop this death, but he didn't. And the fact he participated not out of hatred for Jesus at all, but he did this out of political expediency, that doesn't remove or minimize his guilt in this matter. Now, people that are skeptical of Scripture argue that there is a serious difference between how Pilate is described in secular historical books and how he is described here in the Gospels. There's a dramatic difference. So according to them, the Gospels must be suspect and unreliable. In the Gospels, we are reading how Pilate is vacillating and seems anxious and eager to please the Jewish people at first, until his scheme falls apart and they want Barabbas instead of Jesus. But that was not the historical Pilate. Pilate was an anti-Semitic Gentile, Roman to the core. And because of that, he normally made no attempt to appease the Jewish population. Agrippa said about him, quote, Pilate is unbending and recklessly hard. He is a man of notorious reputation, severe brutality, prejudice, savage violence, and murder. Pilate was himself a hardened, cruel, and ruthless individual. And that often got him into trouble. But the difference between the historical Pilate, as we have just read described, and the Pilate in these gospel accounts that seems to be sympathetic to the innocence of this Jewish man, the difference is not a contradiction, but is explainable in the fact Pilate did not answer to the Roman Senate. Pilate answered to Tiberius Caesar himself. In the political system of his time, the governor answered to no one but the Roman emperor. So it was extremely important, if the emperor was his boss, extremely important that Pilate and Caesar be on good terms. But unfortunately, that's not how it was at the time of Jesus' arrest. Pilate was being investigated by the Roman government. Caesar had ordered surveillance on Pilate due to his suspicion after reading reports about some of his activities. Get this, that investigation from Caesar was going on during the time Jesus was being tried. And this explains why the normal, unbending, stubborn, brutal, prejudiced Pilate seemed so vacillating, seemed to have a soft side, seemed not sure what to do about Jesus. This explains why Pilate didn't throw the Sanhedrin out when Jesus was brought to him. This explains the reason the Gospels present a different Pilate than normal. The fact is, Pilate is scared to death. If he lost his position as governor, then he'd probably lose his life. There wasn't much of a retirement package available for defrocked governors in Rome. Pilate capitulated to public opinion. He caved because he didn't want to add more credence to this criminal investigation that Caesar was already conducting on him. That possibility was confirmed because, and most people aren't aware of this, ultimately Pilate was removed from his governorship, and Caesar banished him to a distant region far to the northwest of Italy called Gaul. It was said that there at Gaul, in isolation. He suffered what sounds like an emotional and or mental breakdown, and then Pilate committed suicide. Curious, what drove Pilate to commit suicide? Was it the increasing guilt of the decision he had made to cave to the Jewish demand and put Jesus to death? I think it might have been. The point is, the gospel accounts are correct. Pilate wasn't himself when Jesus was presented to him. Verse 25, and all the people answered and said, his blood be on us and on our children. That is incredible self-condemnation. This riotous mob of Jewish individuals, in addition to the religious authorities, agreed to accept the full blame of this decision on themselves and their descendants, and agreed to not hold the government responsible if Pilate would just order this execution. Verse 26, then he released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Pontius Pilate released Barabbas as the people had demanded, and sentenced Jesus then to be scourged. The scourging scene in the original unedited version of Mel Gibson's movie was about 11 minutes in length and included almost 100 lashes onto the back of the actor representing Jesus. That actor was Jim Caviezel. And in post-movie interviews, I've heard Mr. Caviezel describe that scourging scene. He said a board was placed behind his back strategically so that the lashes from the soldiers' whips wouldn't actually hit him. But something happened. He now has an idea how the actual scourging might have felt, because during that time, one of the lashes missed the board and actually hit his back. It immediately ripped the skin completely off his back, and the pain was so horrific, he said he couldn't scream. The blow literally knocked the breath out of him. I might add, it is extremely difficult to sit through the entire scourging scene from that movie. I have to turn away for part of it. It is so brutal. That's not artistic license, that's realistic. That happened. I might add, Jim Caviezel was struck by lightning during the production of that film and almost died from hypothermia. It was literally torture for him to play the part of Jesus. I contend right here Pilate was still playing political games. He ordered this brutal beating. He ordered such a severe, inhumane beating on Jesus because as these people witnessed this beating, he had hoped it might extract some sympathy from the mob and cause them to reverse that earlier decision to release Barabbas. He hoped that they would see this and go, oh, no, that's enough. Let him go. Let him go. We'll take him. Keep Barabbas. But that didn't happen. Now, I'm concluding. Seriously. I want you to take your Bible and turn to 1 Peter chapter 2. I want us to notice how Jesus responded to all this injustice committed against him. 1 Peter 2, starting at verse 21. This is some practical application for us. 1 Peter 2, verse 21. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us. There's the passion. The 12 hours prior to his actual death. The passion. Leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. Jesus set the example for us to imitate in handling injustices committed against us. And that example is described in verse 23. Verse 23. Who, Jesus, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him, God, who judges righteously. Now, if you want to take quick notes, you can. 3 things Jesus did in response to injustice. First, Jesus refused to lower himself to the same level as those that caused the injustice. Jesus refused to lower himself to the same level as those who caused the injustice. Notice the statement is made, who, when he was reviled. Revile means insulted. When he was insulted, did not revile or insult in return. Jesus was insulted. He was humiliated through this process. But he didn't degrade himself in becoming no better than his accusers and insult them in return. President Lincoln was once asked his opinion about a certain gentleman. Another political person. And Lincoln shared an extremely positive characterization of this man. And the questioner, after hearing this, was shocked and said, But Mr. President, haven't you heard the hateful things he has said about you? Lincoln said, yes, I have. But you asked me how I felt about him, not how he felt about me. That's choosing the high road. Second, Jesus resisted the temptation to retaliate. Jesus resisted the temptation to retaliate. When he suffered, notice, he did not threaten. Jesus didn't announce to his accusers, okay, it's Friday. I understand, but Sunday's coming. I'm going to be resurrected from the dead, and then you people are going to so regret doing this to me. No, that didn't happen. Third, Jesus trusted God to right the injustice and wrongs committed against him. And I might add, that meant no grudges and no bitterness. Notice the phrase, but committed himself to God, who judges righteously. Meaning Jesus committed himself to God, who is a fair judge. God never said life would be fair after the fall. Injustice happens. And something might not seem fair now, but in the end, God is going to rectify the wrongs against us, so we should just commit ourselves to him and trust him to do that. And that means we hold no grudges and have no bitterness against those that are responsible for those injustices. On June 17, 1966, two black men entered a bar and grill in Patterson, New Jersey, and proceeded to shoot 3 people to death. The authorities charged Reuben Hurricane Carter as being one of those men. Although there was no tangible evidence from the crime scene to connect him to the crime, and none of the eyewitnesses identified him as a shooter. In fact, one eyewitness identified him as not one of the shooters. But he was still wrongfully convicted and given 3 life sentences. Carter's high-profile case became the subject of a 1975 Bob Dylan song, a 1983 Nelson Algren novel, and a 1999 movie called The Hurricane, starring actor Denzel Washington. Reuben was a celebrated professional boxer prior to this incident. And during his incarceration, he studied law profusely, and he became outspoken about his innocence. He was released from prison in 1985 after a judge ruled that his prosecution had been, quote, predicated upon an appeal to racism rather than reason, and concealment rather than disclosure. And Reuben Hurricane Carter is still alive, age 75, and is a motivational speaker and a champion for finding the facts about those who've been wrongfully convicted. He even assisted in the Innocence Project, as I mentioned earlier. And Carter, as a free man, commented on how he has responded to this injustice. Listen to this. The question invariably arises, it has before and it will again, Reuben, are you bitter? And in answer to that question, I would say, after all that's been said and done, the fact that the most productive time of my life between ages 29 and 50 have been stolen, the fact I was deprived of seeing my children grow up, wouldn't you think I had a right to be bitter? Wouldn't anyone under those circumstances have a right to be bitter? In fact, it would be so easy to be bitter. But that has never been my nature or my lot to do things the easy way. Now listen to his final comments. If I have learned nothing else in my life, I have learned that bitterness only consumes the vessel that contains it. Bitterness only consumes the vessel that contains it. And for me to permit bitterness to infect or control my life in any way whatsoever would be to allow those who falsely imprisoned me to take even more than the 22 years they've already taken. And that would make me an accomplice to their crime. That's the attitude Jesus had. And people, that's the attitude we ought to have. Let's bow our heads. Father, you've heard the story of the passion of your Son. I didn't get into the gruesome details because I didn't feel that would be appropriate, but I think we understand the severity of and seriousness of the injustices committed against him. I hope and pray we all understand that we are guilty of his death. It was our sin that nailed him to the cross. My prayer would be this morning, if there's anyone here in this room that has never realized that before, never understood that before, and now understands that Jesus did that so that he might be the singular solution for our sin, so that he might be the ultimate Savior and forgiver of our sin. My prayer is if there's someone here that hasn't made him Savior and said yes to him, that they would even today after this service. I would pray, God, that we would react to injustice and inequity and unfairness in the same manner Jesus did. Because we don't often do that. We retaliate, we are defensive, we are more concerned about our own rights than anything else, and it's not wrong. It's not right. Help us to do the right thing. Help us to be humble. I understand government has the right to enact justice, and government should be appealed to in certain instances when there's been injustice, and I understand that. But help us to do as Jesus did. Help us not to hold a grudge against someone who unfairly slanders us or hurts us. Help us to respond in love to that person. Help us not to be bitter because it'll just eat us alive. So God, I thank you for the lesson we've learned. I just pray we won't leave it here. I pray we'll take it home with us and come back next Sunday as we finish the Passion and as we sit at the table of the Lord and we share in communion together and we remember specifically the death of your Son Jesus, who has made all of this possible. So bless us, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.